Okay, so um, if anyone online can't hear me, then please drop a message in the chat. But otherwise, we'll crack on. So welcome to our third session of the Liberty series of the Buckingham Political Thought Reading Club. I'm Samuel Woodall. I'm doing my PhD in intellectual history, and it's co-hosted by Jack, who's just finished his master's in philosophy at Buckingham also. And yeah, this is our Liberty series, the first conceptual series that we're doing. So we shall start from here. So I don't know if any of you have really read much Mill before, have encountered Mill before, but he's certainly what we would refer to as a quintessential modern liberal. So Mill emerges not just as an influential figure, but as a product of a distinct intellectual milieu. Raised within a tightly knit network of families and philosophical allies, Mill was immersed in an environment of rigorous intellectual training and disciplinary mentorship from a young age. His father, James Mill, was a prominent utilitarian philosopher and a close collaborator of Jeremy Bentham. He played a central role in shaping Mill's intellectual development. Together, this network of thinkers sought to advance the utilitarian project of maximizing happiness through reason, reform, and social progress. Mill's own contributions spanned a remarkable range of topics, including utilitarian ethics, liberal political theory, statecraft, and the contentious issues of his time, such as colonialism. This breadth of inquiry, while unparalleled among his contemporaries, came at great personal cost. By the age of 20, due to the personal pressure put by his father and Bentham as a father's friend, Mill suffered a nervous breakdown, a crisis of identity and purpose. Under the weight of intellectual and emotional pressures, it was only through the discovery of the romantic poetry of William Wordsworth that Mill began to recover, finding in literature an antidote to the purely rationalistic framework within which he had been trained by his father and Bentham. This interplay between the rationalism of his upbringing and the emotional depth he later cultivated reflects the broader tensions of his intellectual legacy. Mill wasn't simply a philosopher in isolation, but a figure shaped by and responding to the intellectual currents, political landscapes, personal relationships, and social movements of his time. Understanding Mill in this social and cultural context highlights how his ideas were both rooted in and transcended the intellectual networks that shaped him. So one of the works that we haven't assigned in any of the essential or recommended readings, but I thought would be important just to gloss over slightly, John Stuart Mill's engagement with utilitarianism was built on the foundations laid by his father, James Mill, and Jeremy Bentham, while introducing significant refinements. Bentham's utilitarianism was based on maximizing the greatest happiness for the greatest number, treated all pleasures as equal, which there's a famous quote, pushpin is as good as poetry. Pushpin was an old game, a little bit like, some sort of game that kids would play today, but the equivalent in the 1850s, 60s. So essentially Bentham was saying that if you sit down and play a fun game as a kid, the pleasure you get out of that is the same as a learned man reading poetry or literature. So Bentham was trying to say, however you get your pleasure, that is what we want to maximize in society. But for Mill, he argued in his Utilitarianism in 1863 that intellectual and moral pleasures are superior to purely physical ones. So he created this sort of division between higher and lower pleasures, adding a qualitative dimension to doctrine. Mill also sought to reconcile utilitarianism with individual liberty, as explored in the text we're reading on liberty. He emphasized the importance of personal freedom and individuality as essential components of societal happiness. Influenced by romantic thinkers such as Wordsworth and Coleridge, Mill's utilitarianism combined rational calculation with a deeper understanding of the human experience, creating a more humane and flexible framework for moral and political philosophy. He also is one of the first male politicians in Britain to address the question of women within the polity. In The Subjection of Women, 1869, Mill advanced one of the most influential arguments for gender equality in the 19th century. His wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, the essay challenged the social and legal subordination of women. asserting that such inequality was not only unjust, but also a hindrance to the whole of human progress. Mill argued that the subjugation of women rested on outdated customs rather than rational principles, and he called for equality in education, employment, and political participation. Mill's case was rooted in his broader liberal philosophy, emphasizing individual liberty, self-development, what the term at the time floating around is this idea of self-actualization. He saw gender equality as essential for a just society, claiming that women's contributions were stifled by oppressive institutions. By linking gender justice to the utilitarian goal of maximizing happiness, Mill reframed not merely as a moral imperative, but as a practical benefit for all of society, that actually society would be lacking if women were not enfranchised. This was a recommended text building off of what we will take from On Liberty. I haven't added this in, but as I was saying to Michelle before we started, Mill is very admirable, obviously, as we can see, in the treatment of the subjection of women. But he, in post-colonial circles, is certainly not admirable when it comes to his treatment of race. There's no sort of specific text on this, but he has quite a lot of views about the idea of what he calls sort of bestial and barbaric countries. And in this very liberal vein, which we see 20th century and even through to kind of neoliberalism in the 21st century, he has this idea that these childlike states, coming back to his ideas of education, these childlike states, particularly he singles out India, need to be raised like children, and he treats them quite poorly by our modern standards. So when it comes to sort of on more kind of feminist studies vein, he certainly is admired, but when it comes to post-colonialism, he has a few issues, but we can come back to that. On Liberty, this was published in 1859. On Liberty remains one of John Stuart Mill's most enduring works, offering a profound defence of individual freedom. At its core is Mill's harm principle, which asserts that the only legitimate reason for society to restrict an individual's actions is to prevent harm to others. This principle provided a framework for balancing personal liberty with social order, addressing the dangers of both authoritarian governance and also the tyranny of the majority. Mill argued that individuality and free expression are essential for personal and societal progress, seeing freedom of thought and debate as vital to the pursuit of truth. His emphasis on liberty reflected not only his utilitarian commitment to maximizing happiness, but also his belief in the intrinsic value of self-development. As a foundational text of liberal philosophy, On Liberty continues to resonate, raising questions about the limits of authority and the nature of a free society. This will be the first text that we address today. And was there something else I was going to add there? Yes, one thing that obviously is quite difficult to work out when it comes to the harm principle is what exactly Mill means by harming society. So there's a lot of debate, even ongoing today, around the harm principle as to whether he simply means physical harm, or could it be verbal harm? And obviously those are the kind of debates that certainly in the US there is much debate around in terms of, verbal offences, these kind of things. Mill's harm principle is essential to the debates that we're having in the political discourse of our time. So it's really, really critical to know for a proper understanding of where our political discourse has emerged from. So that's my sort of preamble done. And now we'd obviously like to hear from you. I've got a few questions there. We can drop in and out of them, but if anyone has any points that they'd like to start with, I know that Jack will have a nice array of different points. So yeah, we'll get cracking. Oh, and also for anyone online, you can drop a message in the chat and I will keep an eye on it.
But I didn't know what it was. We have an Equality and Human Rights Commission that was set up in 2016, and Article 10 says we have protections for the freedoms of holding and expressing opinions, but then they qualify it with the responsibility to the people, which includes the interests of privacy, health, moral rights, reputations, preventing disorder and crime, disclosure of confidential information, national security, and maintaining the authority and the of judges. US, you have something similar. There is the First Amendment, but then 9 years later, they passed what's called the Sedition Act. And this was, it's very strange because when you read the First Amendment, it seems quite pure, but 9 years later, the same people wrote that amendment are producing a bill which basically says that freedom of speech, the First Amendment does not include defamation or spreading lies about government, not about private citizens, but about government, which is quite interesting. Very, very curious. I bring all this up because the book is read and I'm in oversight. I don't think Mill touches any of those kind of exceptions. And so when I read that the chapter, I came away understanding Mill was advocating a very radical version of freedom of speech. He said the power of the coercion of speech is itself illegitimate. So my open question is, first of all, is that in fact Mill technically not interested in those kind of issues? If he is, how does he address them?
I think he's certainly very, very interested in it. And I mean, obviously, I want you guys to chime in, but I'll start off in terms of the context from my sort of more history background. I think he says in this chapter about how if all of society, the very famous passage, if all of society were of one opinion and only one member were of the other, all of society would have no right to silence that one. So certainly he's very, very radical on the freedom of speech. I think the harm principle does muddy the water slightly, but we can come to that. But you've got to remember that at this time, he's facing a world that's on the cusp of becoming a modern society, but it's only back in 1819, less than half a century earlier than when he's writing this, that the Peterloo Massacre has happened, where protesters who are simply voicing their opinion on the streets of England are being shot down by the state's police. So he's certainly in the mind frame of we need complete freedom of thought, of speech. He's going much further than someone like Locke during the Enlightenment, who's simply saying you can think what you want, but essentially obey. He's saying, no, you can speak. And you've also got the emergence of the famous Speaker's Corner around this time as well, where people are standing on their soapboxes and starting to proselytize to the nation. So he's certainly seeing this world changing from a more kind of that what we've looked at so far, kind of the Enlightenment period, where it's much more about thought and freedom of thought. This is freedom of expression and freedom to say, oh, Jen, something there. I'll do it. You can have it on. Publish.
Okay.
Where are we?
Usually the these should be the expression.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, what do people think? I will be able to go back and do a little recap in a second. Let me just check this. Yeah, sorry. So what had you just said, Jack?
we waited to it.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So bouncing off of what I said then, in terms of that historical context, certainly freedom of speech is pivotal, and I think for him undeniably universal. I don't think there are any constraints on it. other than when it comes to this difficulty around what the harm principle exactly is. And the harm principle can be interpreted, as I was saying just before, about physical harm, but it can also be this kind of idea of, well, if someone's in a crowded theatre and shouts fire and there isn't one, surely that person holds some responsibility for causing a problem, than just saying, oh, no, they're completely kind of vindicated, if you see what I mean. So there is a certain level of constraint when it comes to provocation, I think. That would be my idea, but certainly because of the brutality that he's seen, his father's seen within literally the last half a century, he's really, really pushing for this universal freedom of speech.
So you could sort of hold freedom of speech as an absolute principle, but then you weigh it up with the laws that might deal with the consequences of careless speech.
Yes, yeah.
There seems to be some kind of difference between speech, which is dealing with ideas, dealing with potential legislation, or voicing concerns about the state of affairs and the kind of speech. Classic example. I think that we would possible to separate and divide speech into that kind of speech, do you think?
I think it's very, very difficult for him because he also talks a lot about the importance of collision with error and learning. You know, so I think, at least in what we've been reading, I do think that he's really, really not putting any parameters on it, at least from the way I look at it, because he's saying it's so pivotal for the future of this discourse to encounter error, to encounter problems, to then, then come back at it, rebuttal, fortify your ideas, to learn from it, not just rely on people saying that they're right and correct all the time, but saying, well, actually, no, give it a go, see if you get something wrong, see if it causes a problem, and then you build from there, I think, at least. Would you say that that's what you kind of...
That was my reading.
Yeah.
But then there is a point where he maybe puts himself in tension with that overarching emphasis, because remember rightly, he's very positive, he's very optimistic about science, and he feels that we need to enable this public discourse to go on so that we do uterus our opinions and our understanding of the world. And he has this sense that through that back and forth, we will progressively we'll answer questions definitively. He seems to suggest, and he seems to think that science will have a particular role in that.
Oh, definitely. And again, to add some context, you've got the Great Debate, which I'm sure, anyone who's looked at the sort of evolutionary discourse, anyone who's looked at Darwin, the famous Huxley versus, I can't remember what the priest's name is, but the famous one where he says it's around this time, I think maybe 1860s, but I'm not exactly sure. It could be late 50s, 60s, I'm not sure, where Huxley, the ardent defender of the Darwinian evolutionary theory, is at Oxford saying that Darwin's theory is right, that it's vindicated, and then you've got the church bouncing back at him saying, well, how dare you suggest that man has evolved from apes? And then Huxley's famous line where he says, well, I'd prefer to be related to an ape than use my knowledge for ignorance like you, which really is sort of scandalous. Science, very rare that science is so scandalous in the political realm, but certainly, yeah, he sees science, and that's the whole milieu that he's operating in, this kind of scientific empiricism that's happening in the great universities and across Britain at the time. Of course, he can't go to university. I don't think I mentioned that in the introduction, but because he's raised an atheist, he's not allowed to go to university. Yeah, or to Oxford anyway. Yeah. I'm not entirely sure if he does go. All I can remember is that he doesn't go to Oxbridge. I don't know whether or not he actually goes to another university, but I can just remember that he gets.
There weren't many at that time. I mean, he could not.
But UCL and probably King's as well are in operation by then. But I certainly know that Oxford and Cambridge he's not allowed to go to because he was raised by Bentham and James Mill to be an atheist. But that's what I'd say about the scientific element to this, which is obviously the science is contributing to the politics and the politics is contributing to the science, both in this kind of receptive way.
Does science then become a substitute for the very kind of forces which is critical of, which guide speech? But people say, oh, well, but science and religion are comparable. Like, yeah, well, our attitude towards them can be, because science isn't straightforward. It's very much an a posteriori discipline, and all it takes is one new empirical fact to brought to light, and a whole theory can be turned on its head, as we saw in the 20th century.
Yeah.
You know, and so we can get a bit too excited about science, and so we kind of turned around a lot. Do you think he's slipping back with that idea of science? Is he starting to slip back into what he characterised as an intrusive and a coercive way of thinking? I'm possibly pushing down the wrong direction, but it is a side comment. The overarching theme of this chapter is about how really got to battle this out, because so much is indeterminate, and we've got to let all of the facts come to light and not necessarily take anything for granted and make sure all our claims endure the tribunal of scrutiny.
Yes, on the public square.
But I'm also aware that he would style himself a utilitarian. He basically what he meant to be known as a logical positivist.
Yeah, and with that supplementary stuff I was saying earlier about how he clearly creates a division between certain measures which very easily transition into certain opinions, lazy opinions versus well thought through opinions. It's quite clear that he has a judgment, a value judgment on how you develop an opinion. So, but I don't think I wouldn't say that he's actually projecting that into this too much. I don't, at least from my reading. But I'd love to hear from you guys in terms of what you think about this, or any comments you have in general about what we've grappled with in terms of this reading, and then we can return to one of my questions or whatever.
I feel like join the discussion too late on and be able to make anything, to say anything, maybe a bit
later on. Eric, Michelle.
I have to confess I have grossly underestimate time I need for the reading, so I might.
No, that's perfectly fine. We can certainly move on to another question.
Add something to that.
Yeah.
What you mentioned there about about distinctive value judgments, and my sense is that he's striving after a value neutral stance. He wants everything to be open up for debate. But always this paradox in liberalism, which is that it styles itself as value neutral, but it's very much not value neutral. It makes very positive claims about what it thinks the ideal human condition is, the ideal public citizen, the ideal form of government. All these are values. Good. The values, but treating that as the obvious starting point, totally obvious given the historical debate. So I bring this up because there's this guy Isaiah Berlin, we put him in the recommended reading. He points out that there's these two versions, maybe bring this
liberty.
There's two general concepts of liberty, or two questions you might ask about. First is what they call negative liberty or negative freedom, and it's about we set the limits for government interference. So what's the positive space? So what's the available space for people to do whatever they want? And the classic thing is like, you get up to your own affairs so long as they don't harm other people, or that kind of thing. versus a positive critique of liberty, which asks who is the authority which can define the good end towards which people should aspire. And the thing is, that as either Lynn was pointing out, is that these two were paradoxically intertwined.
Yep.
So although you would read Mill and think, oh yeah, he's obviously negative freedom advocate, he's obviously saying government get the hell away. But actually, he's also in the very same time he's putting forward a vision of man.
Yeah.
Berlin talked about the creative, free-thinking despot.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
the ideal version of man. Knowledge is raised to the highest value.
And also to be able to enforce what we've said before. So that idea of positive freedom versus negative freedom, as defined by Jack through Berlin, you can easily define these two concepts as, and we discussed this in the last session, but the freedom to versus the freedom from, right? So freedom to go and get an education, freedom to not be discriminated against, freedom to go and get a job without there being any hindrances. Whereas the class, and that's very much a modern liberal trend. So what's interesting about Mill is he sits on the cusp of the kind of definitions of classical versus modern liberal. So a modern liberal would be someone who we will be looking at in our final one in a few weeks' time. John Rawls is the quintessential modern liberal. We need to make the world, he becomes essentially conflated with stuff like a sort of almost third way socialism. So it's liberals don't like rules because it becomes a little bit too like third way socialism, and then obviously socialists don't like third way socialism because they say it becomes too much like liberalism. So they sit in this awkward sort of space on the political spectrum. But Rawls will say things like we need to make the equality of opportunity for everyone. So everyone needs to have a level playing field, and the government has a responsibility to make a level playing field for everyone to then be able to do, have an equal starting point to then grow. Mill is sort of like the cornerstone between that emerging opinion in the 20th century and the old opinion of ultimately government's sole responsibility is to stop people from either attacking you or taking your property or really kind of mitigating you from going about your daily life. So when you synthesize those two things, like what you're saying about Berlin in terms of that, you get what is kind of referred to when we grapple Mill's kind of idea maybe of a social contract of a political state. People refer to it as the night watchman state. So it's someone who is there to ensure that you don't get harmed, doesn't stop you from, going about your business, and sort of is there to, like a night in the medieval times, like a night watchman on the palisades on the walls, making sure that no one mischievous is coming into town, sort of thing. Essentially, but with an element of positive freedom. That's what I mean. I think this is on the cusp of that modern liberalism, because Mill isn't just saying, a bit like this idea of the freedom of speech stuff, it's sort of like he isn't just saying you should be free from government sort of oppression, government suppression of ideas of thought. He is going a step further by saying, well, actually, there are some issues here. We were just before you got here, we were talking about his passage where he talks about if one person with an opinion and all the rest of society were of another. There is a sense that he's going a little bit further and saying actually there's a responsibility for the state to do something to create, essentially almost to create a level playing field for discourse, that just being freedom from isn't enough anymore. So he's certainly starting to push that. And if you then combine that with what he's saying about women, and in that situation, and what he's saying about, even in a colonial sphere, about intervening to improve nations, there's very much an intervention stance to say we want to push these sort of left behind subsections up to the level that kind of quintessential heterosexual white Western man is. So there are certainly positive elements in terms of what he wants liberty to do rather than just freedom from. So I think he sits at a unique point in between the quintessential classical and the quintessential modern liberal, I'd say. Yeah.
I didn't realise he was conscious of that. Isaiah Berlin writes as though Mill is not conscious of the great oversight, as though he muddled two questions together. And but my sense is that the two questions can't be separated.
Mm,
And I
mm.
think Ileiberlin also knows that, but he thinks Mill doesn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I wouldn't disagree. I'm not saying that Mill I think Mill is quite jumbled in the way he's approaching this. I'm not saying that he's got a particularly clear-cut view of these things. I think many of the issues arise because he's not entirely sure how these things will play out.
Right.
Yeah.
Issues such as his inconsistent, we would say the inconsistent political views, let's say, we applied in liberalism.
Yeah, and how I think what Aside Berlin raises is how do you actually enforce the positive freedom, the negative freedom, without having some sort of positive freedom, some idea of where you're going, almost, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So you have to have both, as you were saying. Any questions or queries thus far? Or online, if
So
people
when you
can
say
hear us.
Still think that women should have equal rights to men, so he was.
Yes, yeah, very much so. Because he's writing on the subjection of women about 10 years after this. I can't remember what I said. Was it this is 59, is it, or 69?
I think the suggestion was 69.
69, yeah. And he writes it with his wife Harriet Taylor Mill, and is essentially saying in this kind of, again, it actually feels quite Rousseauan, but I mean, any feminist would hate to be referred to as linking to Rousseau, of course, because he's not great when it comes to but essentially the idea that if you hinder a woman from self-actualizing, from realizing her potential, all you're doing is hindering the state, because you've got all these components that aren't maximizing their potential. So why would you? There's absolutely no logic in holding back elements of society that could massively ramp up the intellectual, economic aspects and health of the state. So him and his wife pen on the subjection of women and say that they should be enfranchised, say that they should have the same rights. Which is obviously 50 so years prior to when enfranchisement will actually happen. So it's quite impressive. However, his colonial views are a little bit shifty. So in feminist circles, he's certainly seen as very admirable. In post-colonial circles, he talks quite a lot about the need to educate bestial and barbaric states. And this is in a very utilitarian vein of kind of we can provide education to the uneducated parts of the world. So there's obviously that kind of liberal background, but at the same time, a lot of the terminology is very, very kind of backward for someone who is so informed on so much. It's very it's unsettling that he can't see that the way he's discussing these things,
It's or underdeveloped.
No, I mean, I certainly wouldn't say he shows contempt. That would be the one thing I wouldn't say. I think but his issue is that exactly the semantics are horrible, but he doesn't have contempt for them. His idea is that, and this is what I was sort of saying to Jack now, when you combine these things, he's certainly a positive liberal in the sense that he thinks that government should spend lots of money investing in massive global education systems. He's one of these kind of post-Enlightenment thinkers who thinks, one day we'll have this universal government of kind of, a state that will be able to educate and raise people up to really, ultimately he's thinking that obviously it's so westernized, but he's thinking that everyone should be able to maximize their potential. So give money to these states that, as I just said, barbaric, bestial, horrible terms that he's using, so very patronizing. But in his mind, he's kind of but we can make them, they can aspire to be, well, obviously, if we're looking at it through a post-colonial lens like us, but in his mind, he's thinking, I'm really doing my best here. I really want them to have the opportunity. Essentially, it's a civilizing project. It's one of these kind of issues.
You're criticising you. Why? Because obviously it has good intentions, even though it's phrased or couched in language which isn't, very nice.
Because the language is coming out of the context, which is, again, something that lots of people are really surprised by when you read about Liberal Party history, because obviously Mill is also a politician. And at the time, I think it's 1857, the Sepoy Mutiny, if anyone wants to correct me, but I think it's around then. And you get these reports back in Britain of the Indian sepoys who have gone to, I think it's in Lahore or where they are slaughtering the colonial families, because the colonial families have made them. This is the famous thing about making Muslims use pork bullets, so casings of bullets that have pork on them, forcing them to like bite the bullet to then put in. That's where the phrase comes from, bite the bullet. To put in the barrel, and the sepoys get completely fed up of this, and they're like, "You're treating us really poorly, not understand." So they rebel and slaughter families across the various towns that they're occupied, that they're the sort of military for in British occupied India. Obviously, these reports come back to Britain. The British people ignore the fact that we've been slaughtering thousands of Indians for the last few decades and say, "Oh, these white families have been slaughtered. We can't have this." So then even the Liberal Party, who are supposed to be this kind of more anti-imperialist project, start reinforcing their imperialism. So that's the milieu into which this kind of language is coming. So there is a hate there, as well as Mill's kind of idea of educating and improving lives. The language, and I think his like, yeah, I'd say so. And really famously, and it's really sad if no one has heard this, and it will ruin your view of Charles Dickens. But Charles Dickens at this point, as another Liberal Party, not politician, but a Liberal Party supporter, has a famous quote where he says of the Sepoy Mutiny, "I have no sympathy. We need to string every Indian up from Bombay to Bengal." And it's awful when you consider what a progressive he is domestically as well, like Mill. Famous quote. And sort of, yeah, when I heard that, it sort of ruined my view of a nice kind of Christmas Carol, or but yeah, right. Sorry, Jack. We'll go back to yeah.
I think as somebody who graphs of the reading, but I suppose like looking at section 1, the question at the back of my mind when reading was my impression of the beginning of the article is that he sort of says that, you know, we are beyond debate about the value of the freedom of the press. And my impression is that all his arguments are pointing to, well, you know, the justification for absolute freedom in service of truth. But at the back of my mind, I'm thinking about, you know, how he's justifying the absolute value of truth.
Yeah.
I suppose echoes what you said about him having a positive vision of, you know, the value of truth, which is not very neutral. And I suppose many people who have argument with your partners would know, you know, your partner might say, you know, it's not important what is true, you know. And then please note, I suppose many countries are using that very justification to impose authoritarian policies because they see stability as, you know, more important than truth, you know, or prosperity or harmony. And so I would like to know a bit more about, you know, just what's his view on true policy? Justify it, or is it sort of really taken for granted by that point that, you know, truth is absolute?
Your better place for me, I think.
Well, it seems to me I'm also quite, I would say, wary of this aspect of it, for the reason that I think he put it to speak about not about truth per se, but about how straightforward it would be to make that project into society, and it seems to me quite naive about consequences of going through all this public discourse. We all know that the positives of such things, but we don't consider how times throughout history certain ideas have swept through society. People have been very eager to think about those ideas, but at the expense of so much of strife and breaking apart of families and communities, and breaking of higher sentiment and all these different kinds of things. And we so easily get carried away with ideas, and yet things like Mill still remain quite committed to truth. It seems to me that the time world, intellectual lineage where that is just taken for granted. Classic Enlightenment, value of intrinsic value of knowledge, the intrinsic value of pursuit of truth, the unfettered pursuit of truth, anything.
I wanted to continue, but I just butt in. I wouldn't say that he's in an Enlightenment mindset, because you've got to remember that kind of mid-late Victorian period has returned to a very austere religious mindset. And as I was saying about the great debate with Huxley at Oxford, that's really, really kind of like there's all this disgrace around the scientific community. The idea of searching for truth like the Enlightenment had, because the Romantic era has arrived, this resurgence of passion, emotion, but also a Victorian kind of interpretation of Romanticism, which is like button everything down, be austere, be religious, think like that, which relates into the question I put in for question 5 about dead dogma versus living truth, as in like, you know, the Victorian period is this kind of slightly dead generation of people walking around not really wanting to think about things, and when they are questioned they try and shoot down the scientists or the Oxfordians who are trying to have these debates. But yeah, sorry, I just wanted to
He still, but do you think he also changed? I feel like I understand that the society may be changing around him.
so I think he's going in the radical other direction and saying abandon that austere nasty dogma that you have and look to truth, and is prizing truth as something outside of that kind of tight corset of.
So it's almost like gone back to the very beginning of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, essentially. That's what I mean. He's reacting against it. So I'm agreeing with what you're saying, but just wanted to add that as why he's thinking that. I don't think it's because he's still like thinking about the Enlightenment. I think it's because he's so worried that society's regressed to this kind of what he'd see almost as like a medieval kind of mindset. Like, why have we gone back to this sort of thing? Yeah.
What are you saying, Enlightenment? As sort of like the Victorians, they're very restrictive.
Oh no. So I'm saying, I mean, there's lots of debates to have around the Enlightenment, but no, I'm saying because Jack was saying that Mill's in a very Enlightenment vein. Now the Enlightenment very difficult to periodize, but broadly 1650 to 1750 would be about the time that I'd say Enlightenment was, but many debates about that because obviously Kant's writing after that. But no, the Enlightenment, I think, for Mill would be seen as a really free-thinking, liberal time where the dogmas of religion and superstition were thrown off. But he thinks that after the kind of turn of the 19th century, and particularly by his time in the mid to late 19th century, he thinks his generation have returned to almost a pre-Enlightenment period, superstition, dogma, religious fanaticism, these kind of things. And therefore, that's why he's really banging on about truth and about the need to question things, his obsession with testing error to be able to get there. Because the scientists are being derided in the daily newspapers at the time because it's this kind of mindset of no, you don't question the authority, you don't question the dogma. But obviously on the flip side, and coming back to the point that you raised with the question, is but what about when truth becomes the authority, and how does it become the authority, and how do you access it? So, and that's why I wanted you to grapple with it, because you're more of the philosopher than me in terms of how do you get to like the idea of truth as the
Well, there's like a pragmatic way to it. So I've been reading a great economist called Hayek. The
2 weeks? 2 weeks time?
Yeah, 2 weeks time. Yeah. No, 3 weeks time.
3 weeks time, but 2 sessions time.
No, 3 weeks time. Yeah, 3 weeks.
You have been reading him for 2 weeks, so you finish reading him.
No, we have a session on Hayek, but in 2 sessions, but it is 3 weeks because we've got next week a week break and then a week. Yeah.
And he is reiterating a lot of the sentiments around it, but from an economic perspective. So there's a lot of practical utility to truth, but it has to be a decentralized truth. So the kind of thing that Hayek would say is that we don't know all the facts about the economy and about what people are getting up to. And by the time, even if you could centralize all that information by the time.
He has an easy solution with money.
Right.
His solution for the problem is through the market mechanism and the medium of money.
Right.
In the process,
But
you have the distribution of knowledge.
yes, but so the precise solution is, well, we can't take in all that information in a central place, so we let people do get about their economic business.
It is right.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
market. It's
Yeah.
not the planning committee.
Precisely, yes, because and so he thinks, well, you can, if you let people read the price signals themselves,
Leave it to the invisible hand of the Smithian.
Yeah, but when you read it in Hayek's form, you can really understand.
Yeah, but now it's like cybernetic.
Yeah.
It's not like Adam Smith.
Yeah.
Adam Smith is more like logical, random.
Yeah, very spiritual sort of, But yeah, essentially.
It's very concrete, very empty, it's very practical. And so you sort of solve the problem of the complexity of society by letting go. And Mill is, I think, a lot of what's motivating Mill. You think we're the best version of ourselves, and the society is the best version of itself when we have confidence that these ideas that we have, that we share, that we want to perpetuate, have been scrutinized extensively by a variety of people, different perspectives.
Do you make a connection with also economics?
Yes, I think it's the same, because I think they're both looking at the complexity of the world, Mill from a broader disciplinary sense, higher mainly in economics. That's where liberalism shifted more to a discussion about economics. But they're still thinking about how we run society. Go with it, so and they're wary of government, both of them. They're wary of Mill is wary of certain received wisdom, the moralities.
And he has that line about.
There's a paradoxical statement in his textbook, Political Economy, he calls it. It was standard at the time. He was saying that theory is already done. There is not much to be added. So, to him, it was almost complete. Theory, economic theory. He made some tweaks on it. But the paradox is that exactly at the same time, the merging of revolution started to happen in economics. So he was not right in his judgment about the economic matters.
Yes. So this is an inescapable problem, I would say. As well as what I was getting at earlier with his commitment to science, is that science didn't go where he expected. Kant had the same problem.
But at the same time, when he speaks generally about knowledge in this text here, then he's ready to challenge it all the time. He requires it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a fundamental component of knowledge to be able to challenge it.
He wants even the proven truth to be proven again and again constantly. Because otherwise, he says, we are going to forget why it's a truth.
Which is actually very, very, it's actually very modern, because that's also a very postmodernist view. People like Althusser, who in the postmodern movement in the 80s are saying, well, there's no innocent reading of anything. We have to keep reassessing our reading of whether it's politics, whether it's history.
Maybe they think it differently.
Oh, certainly, but it's certainly very contemporary, and the intensity that he invests in this idea of reevaluating the situation all the time, And he uses that line about Socrates and said, we must remember that Socrates and authorities once existed and there was a great collision. You need to have a free thinker like Socrates who questions everything all the time and never withdraws from that. And ultimately that would be the death of him, sort of thing.
There's something connected very close to this that he borrows from Tocqueville, as I remember, and Friedrich Humboldt.
Yes,
It is the tyranny of majority.
Exactly.
So even if everyone is convinced that something, or almost everyone is convinced that something is the truth, still we have to allow the minority, or even a single exception,
one
to
individual.
voice the alternative view.
Exactly. No, I think it's really, really interesting, and I think that certainly is the case, other than when it comes to violence. I think is one thing is certain physical violence, and as we were saying earlier, whether it spans into anything else. But I think with everything, it's freedom of expression, freedom of thought. Other than it's that famous kind of analogy. Well, my freedom to swing my fist is as free as your freedom to place your nose where you want, sort of thing. That's the kind of like, yeah, that's the harm principle.
He's dependent. He's dependent. Any idea.
Yeah.
To be,
Yeah.
to be allowed to
I think
have
so.
presence
But
in the public space.
I think so.
And the idea,
Yeah.
not necessarily does any physical harm.
No, this is the interesting thing though, and I don't know if anyone else wants to contribute at this point, because that's a really interesting point, and it's sort of what I raised earlier, which is that I think he's universal on this, but I don't know. And particularly when you take his ideas into a modern context, a lot of political theorists use the harm principle, but in a different way, and say, well, what if there's someone shouting fire in a theatre and they're making everyone run out? Surely that, and there is no fire. Surely
Maybe
that.
this contributes to the alertness that should be present all the time. Is it why there is a fire marshal there?
Yeah.
To be
able to regulate. Yeah.
But if there is no appointed fire marshal, maybe it's a good idea you to have someone marked in the house who to shout fire time to that.
Yeah. But I'm not sure that he would be particularly easy with, for example, obviously his whole point is about protecting individuals, even if they have differing opinions. So what if there was a political party on the street corner shouting that a certain subsection of society needed to be rounded up? I don't think he would be particularly easy with that, because obviously
they can shout that, but they cannot execute.
They can't do it. But I'm not sure. That's where I think the tension lies in what he's saying. Because I'm not even sure that he'd be particularly comfortable with them saying it. But I don't know. I don't know if anyone's got anything.
I think that he will allow it.
You think that?
And even maybe to stimulate them to challenge the.
Yes, I suppose his idea would be, well, other people will come up and say, how dare you say this, X, Y, Z, and question them in the public sphere of debate. But I don't know. When you see Mill's writing, where do you think that balance lies? Or
My impression was that it was a
universal. Yeah, it's the same.
Which is why I was I knew we tended to make exceptions to this, and I was surprised he didn't raise any.
Yeah.
If I go back to the Berlin's distinction between negative and positive freedom, I think Mill doesn't think through this model.
Yeah. Well, yes. Yeah.
It's completely foreign to him.
Mm-hmm.
He'll understand it if somebody speaks to him about that.
But
definitely.
Yeah.
He's a reasonable man, but it is not his viewpoint. Neither of his authorities.
Yeah.
So
no, I agree.
I don't know how much we can really make out of this conceptual frame, positive and negative freedom, in there specifically.
Example you gave about someone shouting in the street about rounding a small subsection of the society and maybe like killing them or incarcerating them or something. But then that would be physically causing them harm or inciting hatred, and even if it's not causing them physical harm, it is inciting hatred towards this group, and that falls under Mill's harm principle.
We think so, wouldn't you? But as Roman's saying, if they're not directly the ones practicing the actual rounding up, obviously this is a very complex and dark analogy, but if they're just the speakerphone, if they're just the ones saying, well, why shouldn't they be rounded up, sort of thing, like we see in a lot of kind of modern discourse around the world today, a lot of people testing the water, going, oh well, no, I'm not saying that I'm going to do it. I'm just saying maybe, well, we could do this. We could round up this group of people or something. If they're doing that, does Mill's harm principle stop them from doing that, or does it still fall short of the mark? As I say, I honestly am conflicted on what he would think, but I don't know.
Cause psychiatric fear in a lot of the subsection people, and psychiatric fear is a source of harm, psychological harm, and so there is the presence of harm, even if it's not physical harm, and so that should fall under his harm.
And that's certainly the modern political interpretation of his Heim principle.
Mill just predates modern psychology, and the way Humboldt and wouldn't do the psychology is very different.
who?
Yeah.
His party
Yes.
in the 70s.
Yes. They're still sort of partly still in the Cartesian view of psychology as the spirits. Yeah.
I think the answer is there. Unfortunately, I have read this text decades ago. Sorry, but there was something when he was speaking about the truth. He was saying, "I might hate your views,
Yeah,
but
I will.
I love you to have them,
Yeah.
and I'll give my life you to have them."
Yeah.
There was something like this.
Yeah.
So on this
Originally.
on these grounds, then any kind of opinion, as long as it's not really killing you, then should be allowed.
It's something like I may hate your opinions, but I will defend to the death your right to say them. Yeah. But I think it's
He is rhetorically brilliant.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't really remember exactly his wording.
Yeah. No, I completely agree, but I think it's just an interesting tension for modern political discourse at where that point lies. But right, does anyone else have any questions going forward, or any other points from the questions that we've laid out? Or Jack, do you have anything to move it forward? Oh, thank you.
I'm still thinking about the definition of harm, because once it's not just confined to physical harm, like anything can be psychological harm, and it gets very slippery. Like if I'm a snowflake and somebody said, I'm stupid, then that's a harm. And
it's direct harm and indirect harm. So chain causation, like how far down the line has the harm, like is the distance between me and the
here they have to justify to prove that you're stupid.
Yeah, but the harm is already caused. It might be
Why?
too traumatized to ever participate in a debate.
You don't need to accept the facts.
I don't need to accept it, but the harm is caused.
It's another matter if it's institutionalized. For example, you're at school, and then they say you're stupid, and they write you like a score to make you fail at school, and not to graduate or something.
Objective and subjective text. They're like,
Then
if the reasonable man thinks
this
someone should be
is
harmed,
a real harm
or whether
because
the reasonable man
it cuts your life perspective. But just calling you a name.
I think certainly on liberty, I would agree with Roman that what he's saying is very much physical harm. I think where my slightly queering the pitch, so to speak, is when you combine it with his views on the subjection of women, because clearly in On Liberty he is saying that he's absolutely praising universal freedom, right? Universal freedom of thought. But surely the principle on which he's writing chapter 4 on the subjection of women is that there's not a violent attempt to hold back women, but there's this kind of like derogatory treatment of females in Britain, and he's saying that is actually holding back the potential of someone. So that's where I think my kind of slight issue, because obviously no thinker, and this is something we always have to remember when we look at any scholar, no thinker has consistent opinions throughout their life. This is what Dominic the Capra, the intellectual historian who wrote a book called Rethinking Intellectual History, says. Just like ourselves, no one's consistent with their opinions. So when we grapple these thinkers, we have to understand that the best way that we can approach them is by picking out little bits of the ideas and trying to combine to get some sort of universal sense of them, but we're never going to get a homogenous kind of perfectly clear-cut view. But when you combine it with On the Subjection of Women, it does feel like he's got this kind of slight sort of, it's not just violence, but actually there are certain things in society that are causing people difficulty that aren't just violence. There are certain protocols, certain laws, certain views that are holding back elements of society. So when you combine those two texts, I do think that his opinion is more nuanced than just violence, but I'd certainly say that in On Liberty, the whole thing is just violence. It is just, you're free to think what you like and say what you like unless you are committing violence. So I'd certainly agree with that. But I think as a whole, I think he's got a slightly more complicated opinion. But again, that's my opinion. I don't know if any of you read the excerpt from On the Subjection. Yeah. Jack, do you have any point to move forward?
I'm interested in this theme that's been done around here, because this seems to get back to your original question, Lorraine, about why one might hold truth as the higher value and what might the consequences of that be. And me, it's not so much not necessarily the problem that truth is the highest value, but how we respond to that. So it's all well and good that we can express our opinions in a public space, but are we aware of the effect that has on others? Are we responsible in our speech? And so there's a dimension to this whole debate, which is to do with the cultivation of the proper character to engage in public discourse. And I think a lot of people think, oh yes, truth and liberty of speech, and I'll just say the first thing that comes into my head, and I don't care what anyone thinks. I think that's the wrong way to approach it. There's got to be civility. There's got to be a certain common ethic undergirding public discourse. And my sense is that Mill thinks that's really easy. But if everyone can do that, maybe it's a Victorian thing. My experience is that that's not the case. But it's not just an intellectual thing. You have to be smart. I think Mill talks about you have to cultivate a certain. You have to mature to engage. So he's aware of it a bit, but he said, well, what does that mean? It means, well, you develop the ability to figure out what the underlying presuppositions of ideas are. And I think that's something useful. But more than that, it's about having a broader range of experiences to understand the kind of opposition you'll come up against and the kind of thing that go on in the real world and why people think the way they do. But for me, underlying all these assertions is values. Yeah. And that's not a subjectivist claim, because I think you can have a critique of values, because values have to play out their consequences in the world. But we're quite quick to think of these things in terms of like logic and pure reason. But you're dealing with personalities, and personalities have all sorts going on in them. And that makes the public discourse very complicated, very hard to keep a rein on. And for this reason, you get someone who blurts out his opinions about subjugating a certain class of the society. Well, you might think he's being very logical. He has his argument from first principles of the kind of Aryan philosophy, whatever. Logical, great. I had the veneer of reason, maybe, but it's come out with no thought.
I think it's really important, the principle of not causing offence. And so that's ties in with what you were saying about courtesy, civility, and etiquette and this sort of thing. So, like, I disagree with Mill's sort of view that you can say anything, think and say anything you like, as long as amount of physical violence. I think
Look, he's saying
to be
you can say anything to make an argument, not just to shout, to make noise and for fun, but to contribute an idea.
Yeah, but I would disagree, because I think you should contribute ideas if they have some sort of value which helps society along. And if you're just saying things which might alienate certain subsections of society or cause offence, whether it's religious intolerance or hatred or whatever, then that's not helping society along. That's not conducive to social cohesion.
Going back to the Rousseau thing, which we were discussing in the podcast Jack and I were doing 2 days ago, but there is also possibly this kind of, I don't know Mill's thinking exactly, but I get a general idea from the way he was raised, kind of what sort of probably slightly awkward, withdrawn kind of person he was. And he's probably a bit like Rousseau in the idea that I don't think he necessarily thinks in the same way that we would now. I think he probably thinks that if you had a hateful who was spouting a load of nastiness, a load of kind of. He would probably think, well, actually, they're, and this is where it comes back to Rousseau, they're a sick element of society that we will cure by debating with them, reasoning with them.
That's what Mill thinks.
I think so, because this is this tendency with a lot of the kind of centre lefty kind of philosophers of the canon, which is they've got this kind of it's lovely, it's really really sweet. That's what I said.
But at the same time,
Yeah.
he doesn't want everyone
Yeah.
to be of the same opinion.
Oh no, but that's exactly what I'm saying in the sense that
He doesn't want
essentially-
everyone to be convinced
Yeah.
in a single idea.
But I think his view would be if you had someone who was in that position, that they would debate, discuss, and everyone would come to an idea, not the same one, but in a sense of kind of like, right, you've got your opinion here, I've rebutted you here, and ultimately we'd work out, because if you had someone who was trying to endorse violence, that's a sort of sick element of society. It's this kind of philosopher thing that you'll know about, Jack, which is kind of like the state has to parallel the mind almost, and if you've got a sick part of your mind, you need to work it out.
Yeah.
Try and drive it through. It's the same with the state. You can't have an element which is, that doesn't mean that everyone needs to think the same, but it means that you've got to rectify that sort of portion almost. And I'm pretty sure that's probably the way that he thinks.
Normatively, there is the requirement that to be diversity always
Yeah.
in the opinions.
Mm-hmm.
So the convergence, it's not an ideal state. At least in this state on liberty. Probably if you take his economics or political views, probably there it's a bit different. But
Thoughts can lead to action, and it could be, you know, like the beginnings of premeditated crimes and this sort of thing. So you're getting into a really murky area. So
yeah, but
in order-
it's defined by the existing law. So you have legislation and then crime is defined.
There is no such thing as
Again,
crime, yes, but what I'm saying is there's, like, if you think about committing a crime, it's very easy to actually go and commit the crime, and so sometimes you can stop someone off in
And
the
then you bear your
thinking
consequences.
about it and debate with them, so to kind of cure their sickness, as you like, that could really help prevent a lot of crimes.
Which is what I think he thinks would naturally happen, basically. That ultimately everyone would be rebuttaling each other, and in this big kind of public sphere, public square, would be rebuttaling each other. And if you had radical opinions to either end, they would be rebutted. It wouldn't mean that every
Moderated.
moderate, or even just sort of like, but even just self-criticism. I think because moderated or
It's more like a free market.
yeah, exactly. And those, that's a very good analogy actually, because it would be like those opinions would fall out of favour. You know, you'd be on the public square, you'd see that person shouting, and someone else would go up to them and say, "Well, haven't you thought about this?" It doesn't mean that they change their opinion fundamentally, but it means that that opinion sort of falls out of favour, and that person goes home, has a bit of self-reflection and that sort of thing. I would say so. Sorry,
In his economics, for first time, it is the claim, he brings together the supply and the demand side. So we can use the analogy here in the public sphere as well. So, but instead of goods and services, we've got ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And a variety of things. And the requirement, this variety to be as big as possible.
Yeah.
And then the demand for it.
Yeah.
That is testing this,
Exactly.
these ideas. And buy some of them and not others.
Yeah.
So this kind of a market can work, but I don't remember he to make exactly this analogy.
No, and I think we're all sort of hypothesizing off of what we've read here, because obviously we are looking at this in a completely different lens. As I said, in a sense, he's a racist. He is obviously a feminist.
Maybe it's not exactly right.
No, I know, but
Because
the point I'm
it's-
making is we're anachronistically trying to apply the political debates that we're having today.
He's ready
It's
to
not-
admit that,
Yeah.
for example, the Indians will be educated,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
that they will be different.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not question of genius
Mm.
or any characteristic that
Yeah.
these people bear there. Like
Yeah, but it's not particular to the Indian or the Japanese or the.
No.
He feels if he were from another continent and was looking at Europe.
It's a universal obligation.
It's not
Yeah.
about race, it's about perceived ignorance, it's about culture, it's about
And the same is valid probably to the work for the working class here, in his opinion,
Yes,
that they have to be educated.
yes,
as well.
exactly, yes.
Which is also something he's seeing, of course, because this is the great time when you were talking about UCL earlier. This is the great period of the opening up of the arts through the London museums, opening them up for free so that people can travel down from pit towns, from outer London suburbs to come in and see the arts for free. So there is this idea of emancipation, obviously the enfranchisement of women, but also the emancipation of knowledge, that it's no longer going to be a certain preserve of a certain clique. So that's certainly fundamental to this as well. I was thinking of something else, but I can't remember what it was now. How far did you guys think that this text comes across as utilitarianism? I put that one in at question 7, but I sort of phrased it in terms of like free speech. But if you hadn't known that Mill was part of a utilitarian canon, does it come across as utilitarianism to you?
No,
It doesn't. Yeah.
Very pro the individual and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
expression for the individual and protecting the individual from the state's harm. And
Yes, exactly.
Utilitarian is all about the greatest good for the greatest
I
number.
know, which is odd, isn't it? I find it quite strange. Yeah.
I feel the same way. Utilitarianism crossed my mind once, and
At all.
when Berlin was referencing the connection, sure.
But maybe you're thinking if everyone had a better freedom of speech, then that totality would then would maximize the greatest good
Yeah.
for the greatest number.
Exactly.
So-
But which is his underlying thing, but because utilitarianism is so subtle, he has I read a paragraph where he critiqued Bentham, and he basically finds that Bentham is far too shallow, and too
Yeah.
black and white on the
Yeah.
on the possible values we can have, and he's far too optimistic maybe about calculating some of these odds. So Mill had a hypothesis that the best thing for society is for us to err on the side of ignorance and have these continued debates.
I mentioned about utilitarianism. One definition is the greatest good for the greatest number. Is another definition the consequence should justify the means? Is that
Yes, and those
but that's completely different meaning to the greatest good for the greatest number.
It's all.
no, but they sort of mutually entail. So if you have an idea about the greatest good for the greatest number and there's an obstacle to that, you overcome that obstacle by any means necessary. The two propositions tie together. Yeah.
It's the what Bentham calls there's two ways of calling it, but I think it's originally called the philosophic calculus, but now I think it's called the philosophic calculus now because it used to be referred to as the hedonistic calculus, but hedonism again sort of like it causes so many issues because people think hedonism, Greek hedonism, luxury, all going and having, but the philosophic calculus had seven elements to it. So you had to have, I think it was intensity, how great is the pleasure, propinquity, what possible pleasures could it cause in the long run. So from that pleasure that you're getting, I mean, it is an intricate sort of method that Bentham comes up with, but essentially anything can be a pleasure. Me knocking on this table repeatedly could be for Bentham as great a pleasure as me sitting down and reading Mill or something like that, whereas Mill replies, and in a famous passage replies to Bentham and says it would be greater to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So he says, compared to what Bentham has said, Pushkin is as good as poetry, he's saying no, I'd prefer to be someone investigating the world and not content with myself, rather than someone just sitting eating Mars bars and drinking beer but very happy. But that wouldn't be the same comparison point, sort of thing. But no, I mean, Mill's utilitarianism is very unique. I think it's called sort of situation utilitarianism rather than general utilitarianism. So it's much more about judging what situation you're in and how the rules of his kind of, it's basically a deontologist teleology, which is quite strange, but like a kind of rule-based consequentialism. So you are thinking about the end, but you have to apply certain rules. So it's difficult, but you certainly wouldn't imagine that from someone writing such a sort of text expounding freedom and liberty that he would be this kind of
Yeah.
utilitarianism in that family as well.
Freedom comes the utilitarian value.
Yeah, exactly. But to be in such a kind of network or family of utilitarians, well, I think, unless anyone has any final points that they'd like to contribute, we'll probably start to round up. But I don't think we've got any questions from online, so that's okay. But unless anyone else has a pointer or a little, not, then we'll finish up.
Like for you to just recap the this, but we could do that after people.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'll stop that and I'll go through it. And the slides are also on the thing, but I'll go through it and you can have a look. Perfect. Well, anyone else or all good? Marvelous. Thank you all very much for coming. That's been very good fun. Really good discourse tonight. Thank you. Fantastic stuff. Next week, the week today.
Yeah, the reading is all up already. It's there's
Is
something.
it the same thing that we clicked
Um,
to get?